The Dementors. Tom woke Harry the next morning with his usual toothless grin and a cup of tea. Harry got dressed and was just persuading his disgruntled Hedwig to get back into the cage when Ron banged his way into the room, pulling a sweatshirt over his head and looking irritable. "The sooner we get on the train, the better," he said. "At least I can get away from Percy at Hogwarts. Now he's accusing me of dripping tea on his photo of Penelope Clear. You know," Ron grimaced. "His girlfriend? He's hidden her face under the frame because her nose has gone all blotchy." "I've got something to tell you," Harry began. But they were interrupted by Fred and George, who looked to congratulate Ron for infuriating Percy again. They headed down to breakfast where Mr. Weasley was reading the front page of the Daily Prophet with a furrowed brow, and Mrs. Weasley was telling Hermione and Ginny about the love potion she'd made when she was a young girl. All three of them were rather giggly. "What are you saying?" Ron said to Harry as they were coming down. "Later," Harry murmured as Percy stormed in. Harry had no chance to speak to Ron or Hermione in the chaos of leaving. They were too busy heaving all of their trunks down the leaky cauldron narrow staircase and piling them up near the door where Hedwig and Hermes, Percy's screech owl, perched on top of the cages. A small wickerwork basket stood between the heap of trunks and the spitting loudly. "It's all right, Crookshanks," Hermione cooed through her white wickerwork. "It'll I'll let you out in the train." "No, you won't," snapped Ron. "What about poor Scabbers, eh?" He pointed to his chest, where a large lump indicated that Scabbers was curled up in his pocket. Mr. Weasley, who had been outside waiting for the Ministry cars, struck his head inside. "They're here," he said. "Harry, come on." Mr. Weasley marched Harry across the short stretch of the pavement towards the first old-fashioned dark green of the cars. Each of the cars was driven by a furtive-looking wizard wearing a suit of emerald velvet. "In you get, Harry," said Mr. Weasley, glancing up and down the crowded street. Harry got into the back of the car and was shortly joined by Hermione and Ron, and to Ron's disgust, Percy. The journey to King's Cross was uneventful compared with Harry's trip on the night bus. The Ministry of Magic cars seemed almost ordinary, though Harry had noticed they could slide through gaps that Uncle Vernon's new company car certainly. They reached King's Cross with 20 minutes to spare. The Ministry drivers found their trolleys, unloaded the trunks, and touched their hats and salute to Mr. Weasley and drove away, somehow managing to jump ahead of the unmoving line of traffic lights. Mr. Weasley kept close to Harry's elbow all the way into the station. "Right then," he said, glancing around. "Let's do this in pairs, as there are so many of us. I'll go through first with Harry." Mr. Weasley strolled toward the barrier between the two platforms of 9 and 10, pushing Harry's trolley, apparently very interested in the Imperial City 125 that had just arrived in the platform line. With a meaningful look at Harry, he leaned casually against the barrier. Harry imitated him. In a moment, they had fallen sideways through the solid metal onto the platform of 9 3/4, and looked up to see the Hogwarts Express, a scarlet steam engine puffing smoke over the platform, packed with witches and wizards, seeing their children onto the train. Percy and Ginny suddenly appeared behind Harry. They were panting, and apparently had taken the barrier at a run. "Ah, there's Penelope," said Percy, smoothing his hair and going pink again. Ginny caught Harry's eye. They both turned away to hide their laughter as Percy strode over to the girl with the long curly hair, walking with his chest thrown out so she could not miss his shiny badge. Once the remaining Weasleys and Hermione had joined them, Harry and Ron led the way into the end of this train, past packed compartments to the carriage, and looked quite empty. They took the trunks onto it stowed Hedwig and Crookshanks in the luggage rack, and they went back outside to say goodbye to Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. Mrs. Weasley kissed all her children, then Hermione, and finally Harry. He was embarrassed, but really quite pleased when she gave him an extra hug. "Do take care, won't you, Harry?" she said as she straightened her up, her eyes oddly bright. Then she opened her enormous handbag and said, "I've made you all sandwiches. Here they are, Ron." "No, they're not corned beef, Fred. Where's Fred?" "Here you are, dear." "Harry," said Mr. Weasley quietly, "come here for a moment, please." He jerked his head towards a pillar, and Harry followed him behind it, leaving all the others crowded around Mrs. Weasley. "There's something I've got to tell you before you leave," he said, Mr. Weasley in tense tone. "It's all right, Mr. Weasley," said Harry. "I already know." "You know? How do you know?" I heard you and Mrs. Weasley talking last night. I couldn't help hearing," Harry said quickly. "Sorry." "That's not the way I would have chosen for you to find out," said Mr. Weasley, looking anxious. "No, honestly, it's okay this way. You haven't broken your word to Fudge, and I know what's going on. Harry, you must be very scared." "I'm not," Harry said sincerely. "Really," he added, because Mr. Weasley was looking disbelieving. "I'm not trying to be a hero, but seriously, Sirius Black can't be worse than Voldemort, can he?" Mr. Weasley flinched at the sound of the name, but overlooked it. "Harry, I know you are well made of stronger stuff than Fudge seemed to think, and I'm obviously pleased that you're not scared, but Arthur!" called Mrs. Weasley, who was now shepherding all the rest onto the train. "Arthur! What are you doing? It's about to go." "He's coming, Molly," said Mr. Weasley. He turned his back to Harry and kept talking in a lower, more hurried voice. "Listen, I want you to give me your word that I'll be a good boy and stay in the castle," said Harry gloomily. "Not entirely," said Mr. Weasley, looking more serious than Harry had ever seen him. "Harry, swear to me you won't go looking for Black." Harry said, "What?" There was a loud whistle. Guards were along the train, slamming the door shut. "Promise me, Harry," said Mr. Weasley, talking more quickly. "Still, whatever happens." "Why would I go looking for somebody I know wants to kill me?" said Harry blankly. "Swear to me that whatever you might hear—" "Arthur, please, quickly!" cried Mrs. Weasley. Steam was billowing out of the train, and it started to move. Harry ran to the compartment door, Ron threw it open, and stood back to let him in. They leaned out the window and waved at Mr. and Mrs. Weasley until the train turned the corner and blocked them from view. "I need to talk to you in private," he muttered to Ron and Hermione as the train picked up and sped. "Go away, Ginny," said Ron. "Oh, that's nice," said Ginny huffily. It stalked off. Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat down in the corridor, looking for an empty compartment, but all were full except for one at the very end of the train. This had been the only occupant was a man sitting fast asleep next to the window. Harry, Ron, and Hermione checked down the threshold of Hogwarts Express was unusually reserved for students, and they had never seen an adult there before, except for which who they pushed the for the which who pushed the food cart. The stranger was wearing an extremely shabby set of wizard's robes, and had been donned in several places. He looked ill and exhausted, though quite young. His light brown hair was fleckered with gray. "Who do you reckon it is?" Ron hissed, as he sat down and slid the door shut, taking threats to the farthest away from the window. "Professor R.J. Lupin?" whispered Hermione at once. "How do you know that?" "It's on his case," she replied, pointing to the luggage rack over the man's head. When there was a small, battered case held together with a large quantity of nearly knotted string, the name Professor R.J. Lupin was stamped across the corner of the peeling letters. "Wonder what he teaches," said Ron, frowning at Professor Lupin's pallid profile. "That's obvious," whispered Hermione. "There's only one vacancy, isn't there? Defense against dark arts." Harry, Ron, and Hermione had already had two defense art teachers, both of whom had lasted only 1 year, and there were rumors that the job was jinxed. Well, I hope he's up to it, said Ron doubtfully. He looks like what he would be good. What good for one hex would finish him off, doesn't he? Anyway, he turned to Harry. What were you trying to tell us? He explained all that Mr. and Mrs. Weasley argument of warning Mr. Weasley had just given him. When he'd finished, Ron looked thunderstruck, and Hermione had her hands over her mouth. She finally lowered them to say, Sirius Black escaped to come after you? Oh, Harry, you'll have to be really, really careful. Don't you go looking for trouble, Harry. I don't go looking for trouble, said Harry, nettled. Trouble usually finds me. How thick would Harry have to be to go looking for a nutter who wants to kill him? Said Ron shakily. They were taking the news worse than Harry had expected. Both Ron and Hermione seemed to be much, much more frightened than he was. No one knows how we got out of Azkaban, said Ron uncomfortably. No one ever done it before. And he was a top security prisoner, too. But they'll catch him, won't they? Said Hermione earnestly. I mean, they've got all the muggles looking for him, too. What's that noise? Said Ron suddenly. A faint, tiny sort of whistling came from somewhere. They looked all around and found themselves in the compartment. It's coming from the trunk, Harry, said Ron, standing up and reaching out the luggage rack. A moment later, he had pulled the pocket snake scope out of between Harry's robes. It was spinning very fast in the palm of Ron's hand and glowing brilliantly. Is that a sneak scope? Said Hermione interestedly, standing up for a better look. Yeah, mind you, it's a very cheap one, Ron said. It went haywire just as I was trying to get Errol's leg to send it to Harry. Were you doing anything untrustworthy at the time? Said Hermione shrewdly. No! Well, I was supposed to be using. He wasn't supposed to be using Errol. You know, he's not really up to long journeys. But how else was I supposed to get Harry his present to him? Stick it in the back of the trunk, Harry advised. The sneak scope whistled piercingly. Or it'll wake him up. He nodded towards Professor Lupin. Ron stuffed the sneak scope into a particularly horribly pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks, which deadened the sound, and closed the lid of the trunk on it. He could get it checked at Hogsmeade, said Ron, sitting back down. They'll sell that sort of thing to dervish bangers, magical instruments and stuff. Fred and George told me. Do you know much about Hogsmeade? Asked Hermione keenly. I've read that it's only entirely non-Muggle settlement in Britain. Yes, I think it is, said Ron, offhand sort of way. But that's not why I want to go. I just want to get inside Honeydukes. What's that? Said Hermione. It's a sweet shop, said Ron. A dreamy look came over his face. Where they've got everything: pepper imps. They make you smoke out your mouth. They grate chocolatefuls of strawberry mousse and clotted cream, and really excellent sugar quills, which you can have stuck class and just look like you're thinking what to write next. But Hogsmeade's a very interesting place, isn't it? Hermione pressed on eagerly. In Sites of Historical Sorcery, it says that the inn at Hog is the headquarters of 1612 Goblin Rebellion, and the Shrieking Shack supposed to be the most severely haunted building in Britain. And massive sherbet balls that make you levitate for few inches off the ground while you are sucking on them, said Ron, who was plainly not listening to a word Hermione was saying. Hermione looked around at Harry. Won't it be nice to get out of school for a bit and explore Hogsmeade? Expect it will, said Harry heavily. You'll have to tell me when you've found out. What do you mean? Said Ron. I can't go. The Dursleys didn't sign my permission form, and Fudge wouldn't either. Ron looked horrified. You're not allowed to come? But no way! McGonagall, someone to give you permission. Harry gave a hollow laugh. Professor McGonagall, head of Gryffindor House, was very strict. Or we can ask Fred and George. They know every secret passage out of the castle. Ron, said Hermione sharply, I don't think Harry should be sneaking out of school with black on the loose. Yeah, I suspect that's what McGonagall will say when I ask for permission, Harry said bitterly. But if we're with him, said Ron spiritedly to Hermione, Black wouldn't dare. Oh, Ron, don't talk rubbish, snapped Hermione. Black's already murdered a whole bunch of people in the middle of a crowded street. Do you think he's going to worry about attacking Harry just because we're there? She was fumbling with her straps of Crookshank's basket as she spoke. Don't let that thing out, Ron said, but too late. Crookshanks leaped lightly from the basket, stretched, yawned, sprang onto Ron's knees. The lump on Ron's pocket trembled and shoved Crookshanks angrily away. Get out of here. Ron, don't, said Hermione angrily. Ron, about to answer back when the Professor Lupin stirred. They watched him apprehensively, but he simply turned his head the other way, mouth slightly open, and slept on. The Hogwarts Express moved steadily north, and the scenery outside the window became wilder and darker, while the clouds overhead thickened. People were chasing backward and forward past the doors of the compartments. Crookshanks now settled on an empty seat, his face, his squashed face turned towards Ron, his yellow eyes on Ron's top pocket. At 1 o'clock, the plump witch with the food cart arrived in the compartment door. Do you think we should wake him up? Ron asked awkwardly, nodding towards Professor Lupin. He looks like he could do with some food. Hermione approached Professor Lupin carefully. Professor, she said. Excuse me, Professor. He didn't move. Don't worry, dear, said the witch as she handed Harry a large cup of cauldron cakes. If he's hungry and if he wakes, I'll be up the front with the driver. I suppose he is asleep, said Ron quietly as the witch did the compartment door close. I mean, he hasn't died, has he? No, 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 he's breathing, whispered Hermione, taking the cauldron cake Harry passed her. He might be very good company, but Professor Lupin's presence in the compartment had its uses. Mid-afternoon, just as it started to rain, blurring rolling hills inside the window, they heard footsteps in the corridor again, and there were three least favorite people appeared at the door. Draco Malfoy flanked with Vincent Crabbe and Gregory Goyle. Draco Malfoy and Harry had been enemies ever since they had met the very first train journey to Hogwarts. Malfoy, who had a pale, pointed, sneering face, was in the Slytherin house. He played seeker on the Slytherin Quidditch team, and the same position that Harry played for Gryffindor. Crabbe and Goyle seemed to exist to Malfoy's bidding. They were both wide and muscly. Crabbe was taller, with a pudding bowl haircut and a very thick neck. Goyle was short, bristly hair, long, gorilla-ish arms. Well, look who it is, said Malfoy in his usual lazy drawl, pulling up his compartment door. Potty and the Weasel. Crabbe and Goyle chuckled churlishly. I heard your father finally got his hands on some gold this summer, Weasley, said Malfoy. Did your mother die of shock? Ron stood up so quickly he knocked Crookshank's basket to the floor. Professor Lupin gave a snort. Who's that? Said Malfoy, taking an automatic step backward as he spotted Lupin. The new teacher, Harry said, who got to his feet too, in case he needed to hold Ron back. What were you saying, Malfoy? Malfoy's pale eyes narrowed, but he wasn't fool enough to pick a fight under a teacher's nose. Come on, he muttered resentfully to Crabbe and Goyle, and they disappeared. Harry and Ron sat down. Ron massaging his knuckles. Oh, I'm not going to take any crap from Malfoy this year, he said angrily. I mean it. If he makes one more crack about my family, I'm going to get a hold of his head and... Ron made a violent gesture in midair. Ron, hissed Hermione, pointing to Professor Lupin. Be careful. But Professor Lupin was still fast asleep.